Hi everyone, welcome back to episode 6 of The Power of Dialogue. Today's going to be a slightly different episode to normal. We're going to be focusing on a more specific topic. We do not have George today, however we do have a special guest. Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, thanks for having me on. I'm Joseph. I'm a computer science student, but as well as that, I study economics and have an interest in history as well in my free time.
Yeah. When we kind of started the concept of the power of dialogue, I put out a call on my Instagram story for topic suggestions. Joe came up with our topics for today, and we thought we'd invite him on as our resident expert almost on that. You know, his topic. He's obviously very passionate about it.
Yeah, it's good stuff, isn't
it? We're tackling quite a few topics today. We're talking about the defence, the defence department, be it budget or just how it works, and including most of the ones around the world. We'll then go into talking about Afghanistan and Iraq, and then talking about the war on terror and maybe where we're looking to go in the future with that afterwards. Yeah. So, do you want to kick us off, Joe? With the defence budget and the defence systems around the world?
I think kind of the time that we live in is often referred to as kind of the end of history. Kind of the age of empires is behind us, the end of the Cold War wrapped everything up, and we're all kind of living in the worlds of nation states and deciding kind of what's going to go forward from here, in a sense. Of course, we are far past the time of that was referred to as Pax Britannica, where the UK was the sole superpower in the whole world. But I've actually noticed that during the peacetime between kind of 1921 at the territorial heights of the United Kingdom's empire, and as well as today, our defence budget is sat around at kind of a reasonable 3% of GDP. And of course, you kind of have to ask yourself, kind of, how do we justify spending the same amount that we did policing the whole globe, that we owned 24% of the entire world's land and had 300 million people under our jurisdiction, to kind of just being contained in the British Isles?
Yeah. So I think that one of the things kind of with the defence budget is it's a very personal preference of kind of where people are looking as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a very politically, we all want to be protected in some regard, but we also don't want to be over, kind of start being almost too forceful with that as well, and kind of having people feel like the army is actually not serving, not actually protecting them. Or anything like that, but it's just kind of this thing that's guzzling money that could be better used elsewhere in some people's opinions. I mean, I remember looking up some figures the other day of the defence budget is currently, I believe, a fourth of that of the healthcare budget.
But
yeah, but then some, people are still going, is that too, should we then siphon more of that off towards better places, better education, or other departments, health and social care?
Yeah, and it's a strange affair how we can justifiably kind of spend that large amount of money when we've only sort of really got one sort of military commitment, being NATO, and our kind of one overseas interest being Afghanistan as of right now, as there are coalition troops still on the ground in there, even after 20 odd years. And pulling out of Iraq, actually, in 2009, I'm not aware that we have put any of the troops back in Iraq since then, but but still, kind of, we send foreign aid to the US, who kind of has these ventures
Yeah.
in the
Um,
country.
yeah. I mean, but I think what's also interesting is that the people often get kind of very picked up, I think, on how much things are actually costing. We kind of think, oh yeah, we need boats, we need planes, and things like that. But I think very few people actually remember how expensive these things can be. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but there's been some very high amounts of money spent on things like, I think they spent, I can't remember the figures off the top of my head. It was about, I think, nearly $1 million on something like 3 helicopters or something.
That is the right order of magnitude. Yeah.
Yeah, it's something in those regions anyway. But then on the flip side of that, we can also see how useful the army is being, with that defense budget and with those very expensive resources. How then they're also helping. We need to look at NHS Nightingale, and places like that. The army are very useful in building that infrastructure. And actually have been sending a lot of PPE and equipment around the country. I believe they said there's something like they've travelled, I think it's like nearly around the circumference of the globe like 10 times or something in some days, like the military vehicles, because we just have so many just spreading that around as needed. So, defence isn't just looking outwards and kind of attacking as well in that regard, and you kind of going to other countries, but also looking at defending our infrastructure at home through the use of the defence budget.
And I've seen some of the defence infrastructure and budget help support our international aid that we offer overseas, because where else do you have such huge helicopters and aeroplanes capable of delivering aid at a moment's notice in times of crisis, as we're not currently fully committed to large-scale wars. We're trying to we're not anywhere near in the state of World War II. They have the time and capabilities to progress our interests in those ways.
Yeah.
And there's a big problem with the fact that I think needs to be highlighted that foreign aid and foreign loans to countries has often been used as maybe not a weapon outright, but kind of bargaining tool to kind of help support the kind of UK, US global hegemony. There's plenty of times during the lead up to the Iraq War and the Gulf War that threats of breaking foreign aid investments were used to kind of get support for these wars that we wanted.
Yeah. I think that as well, that there's very different orders of magnitude. I think that if we compare our defense budget to that of America as well, and scaling it up, that doesn't work. America does spend a lot more, I think, on defense as a proportion of its budget than we do.
Yeah. Incredibly high amount, yeah.
Yeah. Which kind of, and then if we look at kind of more militaristic states as well, and kind of the proportions of their budgets. I mean, how many terrorist attacks recently, I'm just kind of phrasing, have there been in, say, America compared to here? Is that anything to do with our defense systems and our defense, the way in which we portray defense? We don't necessarily like using it, while America, have been deploying the army during the coronavirus outbreak.
I think, well, there's always going to be a cost of home security versus freedom, in a sense. And I believe that the fact that the US and the UK kind of have very little kind of terrorist instances is probably due largely to geographic location as well, and as well as kind of processes like kind of immigration control and kind of the strict vetting, at least in the US compared to the UK.
Yeah. Tom, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. I think I agree with everything you guys have said. I think one thing that's probably come through is that it seems militaries these days are, at least our military, the US is slightly different, is used more so in times of crisis and exceptional circumstances rather than the wars as we traditionally know them, which I think then raises questions about the value of the standing army and how much we should be investing in that. If it is mainly going to be used for exceptional kind of cases which are unpredictable, and should we be training them in a slightly different way? Should there be different arms of the army which are more focused on the new way in which we're using them, or is the old way of war potentially something which we do still need to be ready for?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's going to be one of those things as well, potentially, that, as we kind of, as everything starts to go towards technology, I reckon that will then also curve back round, and we're then going to actually start seeing more things happen in person. When people realise the defence starts going too much online, and worry about cybersecurity, which is probably one of the biggest threats currently.
That's true, yeah.
Then moving that back downwards, if we start investing too much in that, then if what's to stop someone then taking advantage of a weaker system, especially if they have a more militaristic state?
I think that our adversaries will try and exploit whatever our weakest part of our overall defence is. So and different countries are attacking different parts of our defence. As Russia, a long time definitely not ally, as definitely using their online capabilities a lot, and no one really knows what they're doing. But they also do like flying aeroplanes towards our airspace to see how quickly we'll respond. It's just a pastime of theirs they particularly enjoy.
Yeah.
But we cannot, as they are constantly monitoring that, we cannot afford to let our responses ever be slower than the standards we hold ourselves to. They should never enter British airspace.
Yeah, I suppose the question is, though, if we then start to have putting more resources towards the cyber side of things and the online defence, does that mean we should actually up the defence budget so we can actually cover everything with a suitable degree of security?
That does raise a good point. And kind of, I suppose you would have to kind of look into the specifics of kind of what money's being sent where, to see, kind of reassess kind of what interests we may have spending on, and to value it against kind of cybersecurity.
Yeah. And I'm just kind of talk about kind of ideas and kind of in general, that's my job here. But if we start then looking at how many people the defence department actually employs, not just soldiers but those behind the scenes, in the offices, in the actual military of defence, and the defence department, it's going to be interesting if we do then start looking at kind of either transitioning more online or reducing the defence budget, as some people do suggest. How many jobs will actually be lost? We already have several 100,000 soldiers. I can't remember the figures. I think we spoke about them a few weeks ago. And then that's going to be a very severe hit on the economy as well.
Yeah, about 30% of the defence budget is actually, or at least 30% of the 2.2 billion boost to the defence budget that went through recently is just pensions.
Yeah.
That does make up quite a large part of it.
Yeah. It's all. I mean, I personally know many people in the forces and those who are going into it. If they've trained to go in, maybe that's kind of what they've always wanted to do, or maybe that's what they feel is all they can do for whatever reason. Then, there's a ability then in that case that we're actually taking jobs away and actually preventing more people from getting jobs. I think one of the things with defence is it's such a broad term, as we were talking about earlier. Are we talking about physical defence? Are we talking about online defence? or we're just talking about home defence and kind of talking, and then from that, the army helping at home in that regard.
Yeah,
As we talked about with the
um,
Nightingale hospitals.
talking about what this is for the Ministry of Defence's priorities for 2015 to 2020, obviously protect the UK is number one, but the fifth one is support the delivery of Brexit. They are, after all, they work to achieve the government's aims, which
Yeah,
project the UK's global influence, promote UK prosperity. These aren't the most traditional uses of the military.
yeah,
One could argue otherwise, but especially for the UK, but
yeah. I
it's
mean,
unconventional given our size now.
yeah. I mean, but I think kind of if we kind of start looking back of knights, the old-fashioned knights and things like that. One of their jobs, they were often hired as people to protect deliveries, which is in many ways what we're seeing go on again nowadays.
The Navy mostly protects merchant shipping, especially in the Middle East, is, as far as I'm aware, some of quite big job of theirs.
Yeah,
And that is important.
yeah. Plus entertainment. Let's look at the Red Arrows. Who doesn't love to go see a good, air show, or something like that?
And I think the RAF is going to do a flyby over Sir Tom Moore. Not Sir Tom. He will probably be Sir Tom, but currently
Yeah, he'll probably be.
Moore, the hero of the times.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. We can see then, in that regard as well, the type of people. Obviously, he was in the army quite a while ago, shall we say? But the type of people who do go into the army are often these people with very strong instincts to protect and things like that, and kind of what can I do, and not letting things stop them in that regard. Which is arguably almost more of what we need. Our generation is often referred to as the snowflake generation. Be that right or wrong,
it's a truth. I've heard that a lot.
It's then interesting to see how that then will translate to the military. Actually, I think we have spent a real long time on defence, longer than I was initially planning, and kind of in general. So if you guys are happy, shall we talk about probably some of the more controversial topics, being the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War?
Yes, let's talk about that. And
Do you want to briefly outline it so that we have an agreed? As when the war in Afghanistan started, I hadn't yet been born and wasn't yet going to be born for 2 years, so I don't have the greatest knowledge of it.
Okay, so the war in Afghanistan, as we know it, it starts really at the Afghanistan Civil War, kind of at the start of 1990, where the communist government was facing rebellion against Islamic insurgencies. The Soviet Union, they invaded to help support the government, and the war went on for about 10 years, and it was a complete slog of a war. Some people actually attribute it to one of the reasons that the Soviet Union kind of fell and kind of was seeing all these internal sort of issues around it. So where we come in, and by we I mean the UK and the US, is that under Ronald Reagan, the US and the UK were supplying arms to Pakistan, who would then in turn choose these whatever Islamic group that they felt necessary and give them arms, give them aid, give them training as well. And so a lot of this aid actually goes to the Mujahideen of Afghanistan, who, of course, skipping a few beats, would then actually evolve later into the Taliban. Now, actually, during the Afghanistan war with the Soviets, a lot of fundamentalists across the Islamic world, in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, would actually come to the country, and we'll see this kind of later mirrored in kind of the Iraq war to kind of fight under the belief of going jihad, of like a holy war. And so at the time, the Taliban and Pakistan as well were sheltering Taliban assailants. And of course, 9/11 happens. Now, during kind of even before this, kind of the US was kind of geared up towards kind of Saddam Hussein being kind of the big bad of kind of the Middle East and kind of the world. Rather, there was kind of very early talk among US congressmen to the media that somehow Saddam was behind this. And there was even cabinets actually drawn up during the invasion of Afghanistan that would kind of be responsible for kind of seeing public attention, kind of steering it away after Afghanistan to Iraq. So by the time of the war happens, the US calls in NATO. Actually, I believe it's Article 14. That's if one NATO member is under attack, then everyone comes in and helps them out. And I believe that's the only time it's ever been called in through history. And so the problem was kind of from the get-go that Afghanistan was very much by and away kind of a nomadic kind of country, rather, or maybe that's the wrong word, but it was incredibly mountainous and incredibly hard to control all the different isolated pockets of towns, and cities, and villages. There were numerous attempts to kind of rebuild the kind of ring road in the country to kind of connect the different parts of the country to make it kind of easier to govern as a whole. But that got bogged down, and over the course of 20 years, of course, military presence never really left the country. And the problem is today that a lot of people actually sort of see that the Iraq War was because of 9/11 when they were completely unrelated at all. Rather, none of the hijackers of 9/11 actually were from Iraq at all. None of them had any kind of contact with Saddam Hussein and the Iraq government. In fact, we see intel of this kind of later that was quote unquote real, that the Iraqis had met with some of these terrorist hijackers. But the problem was that Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden really wasn't kind of this sort of mafia of terror that George Bush and Tony Blair were making him out to be across the world. He was really just kind of a kind of subsection of wider sort of members of a group that would have kind of contact with one another in kind of the Maghreb and Africa and parts of India as well. As that was the problem. It was, the Afghanistan war was quite bogged down, but it's sort of one of the precursors to why we invaded Iraq under this kind of liberation guise of fighting terrorism across the globe.
So are you saying that the Iraq War wasn't directly a response to 9/11? It was just 9/11 provided the US and us the ability to go forward and have public perception on their side to proceed with the military action?
Essentially, yeah. It was kind of, it's sort of a two-pronged kind of attack, basically. Truly, 9/11 sort of came about in an incredibly good time for the Americans. It's important to actually mention the Gulf War in this as well, where in 1990 Iraq invaded Kuwait. George Bush Sr. led a UN-backed coalition, get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. It seems fairly cut and dry, kind of looking back at it. But the problem was that there was strange sort of intelligence sort of coming out of kind of the US in regards to Iraq. I actually have here that even up to July 1991, the American diplomat in Iraq said to Saddam that the Americans have no interest in the Kuwait border disputes, and again describing that we take no position on these Arab affairs. And when she met with Saddam later, sort of that month, the then Secretary of State, James Baker, wanted her to enforce that the US took no position at all. And of course then, 1 month later, Iraq invades Kuwait and the US flips completely. In fact, there's even more actually strange intelligence kind of in the build-up sort of to the invasion. So in May 1990, Iraq wishes to negotiate a border with Kuwait, and the US encourages to give them the cold shoulder. The Bush administration was told repeatedly of the military build-up on the Kuwait border, and nothing was done. Kuwait's entire military actually was demobilized up until kind of the very last few weeks. And at the same time, war games were actually being played in the US to kind of simulate what would happen in the events of this if it were to happen. And even a Kuwaiti diplomat in Iraq sent home warnings of an impending invasion and was ignored about it. And after the Gulf War, he tried to organize a press conference to tell this, but was stormed by army officers and ministers, which was reported in the Washington Post at the time. And I'm going to mention briefly the sort of coalition that was formed around the Gulf War, because actually it comes up back again in the Iraq War that a main criticism was that the US didn't actually have the sort of formal sort of UN coalition. But the reality of this coalition was that we sort of see this time and time again, is that the US was able to use.
So I think we're having a few technical issues on Joe's part there, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Hopefully it will sort itself out. What do you guys think kind of what's been kind of said up till now, of kind of motivations behind the wars and things like that?
I think it's a super complex situation, and I think it's impossible to know the motivations, at least with the information that we've got at the moment, or which has been sort of released. I think with the Middle East, kind of more generally, the amount of complex sort of interdependent relations and the factors which go into the decisions which they make in terms of like sectarian identities, just cultures, their way of life, their political system, and so on. There are so many different things which go into their sort of way of life as well, which I think adds another level of complexity, because it's things that we and our sort of Oriental Western perspective struggle to understand.
Yeah, guys, Joe, are you back with us now?
Hope so. Yes.
Yes, hopefully.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, guys.
That's okay. I'll cut to the chase and actually start talking about the Iraq War. But the aftermath of the Gulf War was that because of stuff that the coalition forces use, like depleted uranium, Iraq had the highest in the world for leukemia deaths. 92% of electricity output was destroyed, 80% of oil refineries, infrastructure was essentially wiped out. There was a death toll of up to 500,000 children because of sanctions placed before the war, and that would be continued to be placed up until the invasion in 2003. And planning officers were quoted with saying that these attacks on infrastructure that they did during the war was to accelerate the effects of sanctions. And this would all help the US sort of justify that under Saddam, Iraq was a failed state, and that they needed to sort of come in and sort of liberate all these people. Now, we get to the point where we talk about Tony Blair and the justifications that he had for giving George W. Bush the blank check to invade Iraq. So at the time when this all sort of broke, kind of the actual sort of credibility of the reporting, this was the dodgy dossier. MI6 was found to be using third-hand according to the reports. The 45 minutes for WMD to be launched, which was claimed by Tony Blair, and was actually referred to by George Bush's CIA director as the vague 45 minutes ship, was found to be false and actually just about launching conventional weapons. Claims of aluminium tubes for nuclear centrifuges, which is just used to make conventional weapons on the cheap. Another one that we claimed that Saddam was purchasing uranium in Niger was based on forged documents and never actually panned out at all. It's actually interesting that Tony Blair was told that Saddam had a chamber in his palace filled with little green vials of gas, which was eerily seen to be derived from the Michael Bay movie The Rock, starring Nicolas Cage. There was found to be wholesale plagiarism of a paper by a student at a California university that was used for intelligence. We also claim that 9/11 hijackers met with Iraqi intelligence in Prague. The Czech Republic's government proved that this was not true. And that was kind of the justification that we used. And we would then sort of actually repurpose and use later to first invade, and secondly to explain that why everything was going so poorly after we invaded.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think people kind of, everyone always kind of forgets how much build-up there actually is behind these things. People kind of go, "Oh, this happened, therefore, we go to war." There were things building up, for instance, for the assassination at the beginning of World War One. But kind of there's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. I think people kind of always forget how much stuff there is that builds up kind of in the background before it actually gets to this, whether it be intelligence that is right or wrong, people's intentions, failed diplomacy in places. I think you can get quite lost kind of behind the kind of veneer of what's being shown. I definitely think.
Yeah, there was.
So yes.
Sorry, I have a quite poor connection. Yeah, there was a very long build-up to this, and a lot of people sort of like to think sort of US Army and the UK Army as kind of being kind of incompetent with kind of how they handle the invasion and how badly everything went and how badly everything continued to go after that. But it more seems to be sort of from what people were saying in sort of inner circles of the army that exactly what they were doing, that they just didn't care.
Yeah. It's one of those things that those people, we can all speculate about what it was based on what we've seen and what we've heard and kind of what people have been saying. But I think this is one of those actual topics that it's going to be very hard to know exactly why it happened the way it did. So Ryan, you look like you were going to say something.
Well, it's the general question to all of us, and probably you guys will know more, especially Joe, is how did the Iraq War, did it advance our interests in the world? Why? Because did it, in the end, benefit us? Because I know why we went into it, because there were said to be weapons of mass destruction, which would provide for global security some form of reason to invade. But in hindsight, was it all wrong, in your view?
There's an argument. Well, it's very complicated to say whether we actually got what we wanted. If by getting what we wanted Saddam removed, then yes, we sure did get that. But kind of the sort of interest in Iraq is kind of where it's placed, kind of in the Middle East. It's a buffer state to Iran and Saudi Arabia. it's got a very narrow coastline along the Persian Gulf, which of course a loss of crude oil actually comes through there. And in fact, when the Ottoman Empire fell post World War One, and we were actually creating the colony of Iraq, we deliberately drew the borders so that we would then kind of have this kind of sort of dominance over the Persian Gulf because of our interests actually in Iran with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And following the years after, we coalition forces managed to rebuild the Iraqi army to, of course, which helped serve us in the fight against ISIS and intervened in the Syrian civil war. But then, of course, you have to argue that was the cost of human lives and suffering that we put the country under for so many years, and whether it be under sanctions in the 1990s to cause the insurgencies from the 2000s, was any of that worth it? The Iraq that we have now.
Yeah. Tom, do you have any insights? We can't hear you, by the way.
He muted himself.
There we go. All sorted. Yeah, no, I don't think I've got anything particular to add other than, yeah, just to kind of highlight the complexity of it, like I kind of did earlier on, and that is in part why I, don't really have a massive understanding of how it all happened. I think what is kind of interesting from what you guys have kind of been saying is just the extent of the dodgy evidence and the questionable motives, which I think make it really easy to suggest that it was completely malign intentions. But then, having said that, I think from my knowledge of the inquiries which have happened, there seems to be little to point to massive wrongdoing, at least by our government. I'm not sure whether that's 100% right or not, but my inclination is that there might have been questionable evidence, and the effect might not have been what was desired, but I think the motives were not as bad as can be portrayed given the questionable evidence. I think that there was good intentions, but obviously things unravelled quite quickly in not a great way.
Yeah, and good intentions in themselves can also be subjective. Good for who? Good for why? Good for when?
Yeah.
I don't think there's kind of much more. He's kind of one of those topics that's talked about a lot, but I don't think there's actually much to say other than what we've really said and kind of talked about the history of it.
Well, part
Yes,
of a more hypothetical question that I'm sure Tom might be able to answer in more hypothetics is, what is the bar to invade a country? Is that weapons of mass destruction is quite a high bar for proof of weapons of mass destruction, or is it widespread human rights violations, or simply they're not a democracy or they're communist? Is that just simply all we need to launch a military invasion? Should it be all we need? What do you think of?
I think it's a really good question. You go. So I have to. You go.
Okay. Well, those justifications, of course, threats of weapons of mass destruction probably is more kind of a valid reason for invading a country. But of course, you can get around that by completely faking intelligence. On the interesting topic of human rights abuses, so of course, some of you may know that Iraq was run by the Ba'athist Party, which had got its sort of start in the 1950s after they threw their British-backed king. In fact, insiders of the party quoted that they came to power on a CIA train, and there's even declassified reports from MI6 of agents actually meeting with Saddam in the 60s. And furthermore, we continued to support the Ba'athist Party in Iraq because they were incredibly effective at rounding up and getting communists on the map. And again, we supported Iraq during the Iraq-Iran war after the revolution revolution in Iran overthrew our sort of puppet Shah that we appointed there, and we gave them chemical weapons, in fact, which then Iraq turned around and used actually on its ethnic minorities. And we sort of, you see this pattern over and over again, that's sort of, so that the UK and the US don't really care about human rights abuses, sort of, as long as it furthers their own interests. You see that the sort of Gulf War, that the US stopped complaining about Kuwait's actually human rights abuses of poorly treating their expat workers with slave-like conditions, and still today you see like the UK and the US selling arms to Indonesia just because they're a right-wing government and who use those arms to persecute their own minorities. And it's really, human rights abuses will only go ever as far as sort of the party crying about them will ever want to, because otherwise, if it gets in the way, then they won't care at all.
So we use them as a justification, but we support groups who commit them simply because they're the least bad out of the options, or the risk of us getting involved, that we don't want to limit any human rights violations committed by us, but if we hand arms off to someone else, that's not our problem. Is that a fair evaluation?
It's a fair justification, I'd say. And there's even the problem is of the US and the UK committing human rights abuses themselves actually in Iraq, with the horrible, horrible prisoner abuse that happened in Abu Ghraib, which I'm not going to get into all that happened there, just because of like how graphic and how awful it was. But the US police military in Iraq at the time was supported by the UK, so at worst we are kind of the better, actually, rather, we were complicit in these crimes, and at worst we were actually a direct cause of the suffering.
Yeah. Tom, you were going to
I think I agree with what Joe has said. I think the hypocrisy with international relations is kind of massive. Whatever suits your interest, even if it means that the bar just constantly gets shifted, the goals are moved, then that's kind of the way it is. I don't think it's a good thing, but I think when it comes to kind of go back to the original question about where the bar is for intervention, I think defining it is difficult because I think it moves a lot depending on the context. So, because for me, I look at like Syria and Bashar al-Assad, and I'll be thinking, yeah, that guy's got to go. I mean, that's just absolutely crazy. All the stuff he's doing, it's just an absolute disgrace. But at the same time, I think you've kind of got to weigh up the consequences of removing him. Who's going to replace? Everyone always talks about the vacuum and the knock-on effect. And I think the Middle East is the key example because it is so complex, because there are so many different dynamics at play. It can never just be a simple operation of removing a leader and then things are all sorted. So I think the justifications are difficult these days because I think things have become more complex, and so I don't think there's really such thing as a surgical operation anymore, which is just nice, simple on its own, doesn't have many unintended consequences. So I think, having said that, there is things we should be doing when there are states which are just in flagrant violation of international law. But I think intervention is a difficult one and probably something we're going to see less and less of, particularly with this sort of rise of nationalism and populism and so on.
Yeah, certainly. We have been on this topic for quite a while, so I think I do think we're probably going to end up overrunning, but that's fine. So kind of continuing, very much on from what we've been talking about, the war on terror, and the form that takes. I think that the first time we really stopped thinking about it, kind of the kick off to this was, of course, 9/11. That's when I kind of say probably modern day terrorism is and was defined. With these kind of large scale acts like we still have kind of probably more like domestic terrorism and things like that, but when it's an organised attempt by a group, and a group with interest in that as well. I think we've obviously been able to see terrorist attacks increase in frequency in recent years. I remember the time when it was very shocking to see one on the news, and it's still it's equally it's still shocking nowadays. But I think what's actually more shocking is how we're also only caring about when our people are involved. It wasn't a terror attack in the same way, but we had just kind of for comparison, we had the shooting in any European country or something like that, and how that was portrayed on the news, versus how many people saw headlines about the shooting in Canada just a few weeks ago. I think it was last week. It's not necessarily just the war on terror; it's the war on terror that affects us. And I always find that's an interesting and peculiar line to draw, because isn't kind of terror. Terror isn't surely something that's actually almost directed towards people. What they're trying to attack is ways of life. In many of these, in many regards, and so why do we actually care more about the people currently involved in some ways, more than actually the people who will be involved, and who actually in many ways are attacking the population of every country who holds the culture that they disagree with.
I think it is a price that's sort of inserting ourselves sort of into these sort of foreign wars and politics and sort of the collateral damage that we cause, that there is going to be a response like that to this. And it's always shown itself in history that that's how it works. People feel threatened by you, and it's a really good unifier against you.
Yeah.
Well, from our perspective, we would unite and put all party politics aside to attack any country that attacked any part of UK territory that we hold. And then we criticise countries when groups are all fighting each other. We invade and join in, and they all hate us for some reason because we've invaded their land. They view it as a decision amongst themselves who controls their country. When we get involved, then they just want to get rid of us.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting as well to look at how many actually groups have now started going. One group may have started the attacks, but then we also have other groups that we then almost attacked because of that. The attacks nowadays are spread, across a wider base. Yet we're still also going after the same people who weren't actually the same people who were involved in the first place. And you have to kind of wonder how much of it's almost a tit for tat in some regards, as well. Whether or not the military has actually affected. The military trying to defend our way of life is actually also one of the biggest threats to it.
That's a good point. I think we don't ask ourselves kind of enough that with the kind of dominance that we have over the globe, is everybody going to be on board with that? Can our culture and cultures of places around the world even sort of connect properly?
Yeah. Ryan and Tom, do you have anything to add?
Don't think so. No.
It's just simply whether you view it whose responsibility, if anyone's, is it to be the global police? As many cases that's the UN or NATO who takes up that role, but the UN often won't act because of political issues. between permanent members of the Security Council, and that just leads to the US taking action themselves, or Russia or whoever wants to take action, taking action without outside of UN resolutions.
Yeah. I think that's kind of, because we are starting to run out of time, I would have liked to kind of talk about this a bit more, but I don't think there's much to say. We've said terror's bad. We've
Yeah.
looked at kind of potential contributing factors to the increase that we're actually seeing. So there is definitely more of an increase going on. I'd say in recent years. It's slowed down a bit now, but we're going to have to.
Feels like it, yeah.
But it'll be interesting to then see where that's going in the future. Which leads us nicely on to kind of what I'd like to just kind of spend the last few minutes talking about, which is future defence. Where's it going to be going? The likelihood of another Cold War potentially, or even who would be the enemy in that. We've seen China and Russia have both kind of been coming more prominently. China a bit more in the background, but it's definitely amassing slightly more power, I think, than a lot of people realise, and is actually slightly more threatening. I think it's getting more and more threatening as it's going on. And so, kind of where defence should be going. We've already spoken about earlier, kind of the shift from physical to the online realm, which I think will be inevitable. But then we also need to balance that out in the other way. So.
Yeah, I think the threat is definitely changing, and I think we're not doing enough to adapt to it. I think it's changing rapidly as well, and it's becoming a much more dynamic and resilient threat, not something which you can just end with a few bullets. It's something which is so complex and interconnected and dependent on a number of different factors that by taking one element of it away, you can't sort of crush the whole thing. I guess back in the day, you could have taken out the leader, and that would massively compromise the ability of the organisation to be able to act with any sort of serious impact. But today, if you take the leader...
Oh, I think we've lost Tom there. Ryan?
Yes, I'll wait, let's see if Tom comes back. But I think that, our future enemies are less so state actors in terms of a war as we see it, or military action in the conventional sense. I think the threats are more like, in times like this, it's still weapons of mass destruction, but it's those falling into the hands of terrorist groups who have no regard for anything, and will simply wish to use anything they get their hands on. Because how do we defend ourselves against a threat like that?
Yeah.
But then it will always come back to the old enemies of North Korea, China, Russia.
Yeah. I think we've lost Tom there, unfortunately. But I think that it's going to be very interesting watching how kind of people then start adjusting in their mindsets towards war and things like that as well. It's been a while since we've had a. Sorry, we've just got a message from Tom, making his apologies. It appears his laptop has had a technical issue.
Oh, good.
So he may or not be back for this at the end of it. But I think it's going to be interesting, as I was saying, to see where everything's going to be going from people's perspectives of things, because I think we haven't had a proper experience in recent years from a big war. Many of us were brought up with wars going on in the background, but it's always been very much in the background and not as much in the forefront as they used to be. We're more seeing things like the war on terror and terrorist attacks, but only ones that affect us in some form or another, either indirectly or because it's in a nation like America or or a European country, and seeing whether or not that actually will either start, whether that's going to actually change people's opinions of war in that regard as well. You know, the future generations seeing an almost softer approach to it.
I think I'm going to be a bit contrarian here with sort of what everyone else has been saying, but I firmly believe that we are either past the days of interstate conflict on a larger scale, or we are going into that in the near future. The way I see it is that the sort of kind of level of globalization that we have reached in recent years that have allowed places in like Africa, Southeast Asia, and China to sort of reach the kind of level of economic growth they've reached. And with the increase in actual democracies in the world and less autocratic rulers, that solving disputes through diplomacy, that be through sanctions or threats of taking away economic aid to sort of get countries in line, I believe we're going to see more of that over the years than actual conventional war.
Yeah. But it's going to be interesting if it does shift in that regard, and that's where we then start putting our focus, and we then start reducing a defence budget. As we were talking, as we were kind of talking about earlier, then that makes us weaker in that side. So we wouldn't necessarily even see a large-scale threat coming from that point. You know, there's so many military war games and stuff going on in the seas currently. I can't remember. There were two countries involved. I think it was America and Russia. Not Russia, or Ukraine, something like that. They had two boats. They had an American warship, and then two smaller gunboats were kind of too close to their waters.
Iran.
That was the one. Yes.
Yeah.
It's always Iran.
Yeah.
Iran loves doing that.
You know, and so the question is, you know, as long as we have these things, they're going to keep doing that, or does that mean we have to have these things because they're going to keep doing it? It becomes a paradox in and of itself. And I think it's going to be very hard to transition over from that. You know, obviously, no one wants conflict in the world. No one wants these large-scale conflicts and the large-scale loss of life that comes along with that. But you know, it is inevitable in some regards that we will also have to have some form of defence as, you know, things change. You know, we can already see, you know, I don't really want to liken, you know, war to fashion. You know, we can see that, you know, fashion will kind of come and go and trends will come and go.
So yeah,
they will cycle back round through it, and you know, it'll be interesting to see if that happens in a similar way with defence. Now it's kind of reached a point where we have two major forms, and then form that will then take.
Is what you're trying to say is that no UK politician at the moment, like, is going to be happy to try and pursue a military invasion, as you've seen in Syria. We've limited ourselves to airstrikes and not boots on grounds is now a no-go because of what's gone before and how that hasn't worked.
I mean, that is true. That wasn't what I was saying. What I was saying is the nature of the ways in which we I think now we've reached a point where we're going to be in, you know, a form of constant switch between two almost states, kind of switch between maybe the less physical versions of war and kind of try and go to more war of words and the kind of online side of things, to then going back maybe in, you know, whether it be a few decades or whatever, to actually a more boots on the ground style. You know, I think, you know, as we see with many things, once you reach a certain point, we often see that then that cycles around. We see it with economies, we see it with many different things. You know, we get to a point and then we normally see that there will be some form of drop in that at some point due to whatever, and then that has to build back up with this never-ending cycle.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and I think on that very, very cheery note, we're probably going to have to kind of start calling it a day there. Thank you so much, Joe, for joining us and kind of having
Thanks for having me.
For
having a
being
chat
the
with us
expert.
today. Yes, our resident expert on defence now. Thank you, as I like to say, thank you to our many thousands of viewers. We are sure, you know, we know you're out there somewhere.
Yeah, coming in one day.
Yeah, and so yeah, thanks everyone being here. Tom does make his apologies for not being able to unfortunately see it out. But yeah, see you guys hopefully all next week, or our audience members watching. And we will have to. We haven't quite decided on our topics yet. I think we're probably going to then do a bit of a COVID catch up and then see how much news has happened in that time. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you.